In a book called Nurtured by Love, Suzuki takes the time to describe his training of a parakeet. I don't know if I've mentioned this on the air before, but it's really worth mentioning for a second because he's talking about how you develop your own brain actually, and to become a good painter, that's what it's going to require that you change your mind. I guess you could say. When we're talking Boston School painting versus outline painting, there's another whole thing where you really got to change your mind. But how do you develop those synapses, right? Which is, I think, the right name for them. Anyway, what Suzuki says is he trained a bird to say, and I wish I had the book in front of me, I don't, but he trained the bird to say, why don't we just say hello? And he repeated for 20 minutes a day the word hello, 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 right? 20 minutes a day. And the bird listened to him and looked at him like he thought he was stupid, I guess. And went on with his normal chirping. But somewhere around the 6-month point, the bird said, hello. This parakeet spoke right up. And then Suzuki says, and by the way, Suzuki is the music teacher who says that give me a mediocre talent in 10 years and I'll give you a genius. He's the guy who teaches orally. He teaches people by teaching children to play violin, for example, by playing Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. And so in any case, the next thing, it took him 3 months, and he said, so he might have said his name. Say his name was John. He would have said, he said to the parakeet, hello, John. And the parakeet, after 3 months, managed to say, hello, John. And so Suzuki goes on to say, and I don't know exactly what time frame this took place, but he went on to say then that one day he walked into his apartment and the bird was singing Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. He was chirping Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. So at that point, the bird had taught himself the next group of things, and of course the repetitions probably around the music studio helped a great deal. But you follow the idea of his thinking, though, is that you have to, by hard work and labor and so on and so forth, get your brain working a particular way, and then it can do it. Then it can begin to evolve itself. And that's what I found huge, huge, huge. I went out, as I said, I started with an impressionist thing, but you wouldn't say that I really had a mindset yet. I got to Gamble and I really developed an outline-based mindset. I really became an academic, and then I found that it was inefficient, and I had to reinvent myself, so to speak. And I didn't precisely know how to do it. I just had to work hard at trying to get a painting started in, shall we say, the right way, in this visual way, and then keep it going there. And I had to, as I say to myself, I had to keep backing this truck back up out of this rut, which was the other way of thinking, and then place it in the right track again and try to retrack myself. These are images I had in my brain at the time, but I had no idea how brains worked. But our topic today, as you can see, is the question of the organized mind. It's a question of various aspects of how the brain works. And I've never stopped sort of wondering about some of that stuff, only because I found myself over time being successful, but over time. And I sometimes wonder if there's any benefit to a young person to hear this earlier. You just have to work your way into sort of inevitably the same conclusions, the same possibilities and the same conclusions. I don't know. But I wanted to reference this book. This is by a guy named Daniel Levitin, and I'm anything but a scholar in his field, but I don't even pretend anything like it. And in fact, when I look at somebody's book like this, I read it for what I can get out of it. I don't pretend to be a good reader, a good auditor of his material. I just see what he's talking about in large ways, and I recall having used some of what he's saying. And then so I'm able to bring this to some of my students from time to time and say, can you allow that this might be true? So I'll read you a couple of these things and give you an idea what I'm talking about. And I promised you this a few weeks ago when I was talking about another aspect of thinking and learning to think. This is that other portion of that thing that I ran into only just recently, in the last summer. So here's a quote. It's as though our brains are configured to make a certain number of decisions per day. And once we reach that limit, we can't make any more, regardless of how important they are. Now, I'll read another one. The decision-making network in the brain doesn't prioritize. We have trouble separating the trivial from the important. We have such a thing as decision overload. They talk about decision overload. And once you've reached that point, how poorly you decide, how poorly or if at all you can even make decisions. So then we get to this thing where he says, so many trivial decisions created neural fatigue, leaving no energy for important decisions. So there's this thing called neural fatigue. Now, why am I talking about all this stuff? How does it relate to painting? Well, everything about what we do is about prioritization, right? Now, if you talk about the organized mind, like we did before, and you say, well, what in the heck are we organizing? Have we named what it is that a picture encompasses that we're then, or let's say, yeah, you can say that a picture encompasses the visual world in front of us, that part of it that we might be able to put on paper. Have we comprehended what the content of that is? And then have we got to the point where we're saying, well, then it's just a question of organizing, isn't it? So that's organizing the material, but to do that, you got to begin to organize yourself, what's important, what isn't important, and it's one of the beauties of the Boston School way of painting, though, is that they've done that. They've actually decided what's important and what isn't important. And so when we come to this discussion of visual order, that's exactly what that is. But it's what is visually important. And visually important means strong. For example, what you can see from across the room might just be more significant than other things to the viewer who's coming into the room, right? When we talk about that idea of the distribution of spots in the value in the tonal world, the play of the spots, that's an intriguing and a potentially attractive thing to someone coming from across the room if that's all you see. If the most prominent points in a painting are these really strong lights, and they're doing something intriguing, won't you definitely get the viewer to come your way? Now, of course, that's a greedy way to use it. But in the fact of just trying to paint something you see in front of you, there is a prioritization, though, based on whether or not those people are going to see it or not, based on an orderly way to proceed so that you will spend early time with important/strong things. So alternately, the other way would be, well, we're going to draw a nose, right? And before you know it, you're finished with the nose, but you're almost exhausted for the painting. You've got a wonderful eye, you've got a wonderful nose, but will you ever have energy for the whole? Now, if anybody understands Impressionism at all, the whole is the thing, right? Is the beauty of the ensemble, the beauty of the play of all the parts to each other, like a symphony. And if you don't have time for that, for the grand unity of the whole, because your process is one of traveling from top to bottom, you won't have it. You won't get that, right? Now, again, you can create different priorities. You can say, no, my job is to noodle every half inch all the way down mindlessly because what I want is a photographic resemblance. That's your priority, right? But if your priority is different, if you actually, let me put it in a different way though, but we create different priorities for the reason of practical use. In other words, if we know some things are more important than others, we actually find ways of dealing with those things first, getting them out on the canvas. So when a Boston School painter lays in a painting, he covers the canvas in the first day, right? But he doesn't cover it with sludge and mud and foggy drawing. He articulates anything he's chosen, any place he's chosen to work. He's chosen to do well in those locations. If he's putting a color down, he makes sure the color's right, and particularly right in relation to all the other colors. The Boston School painter, with his start, has said what the important things are, and he's put them out there on the table, and he said them well. So if you get that, you understand that the whole process of painting is one of understanding significant versus insignificant elements of the visual impression. Okay? Now, even if you're an imaginative painter, there is still, as it were, a visual impression out there. And if you don't know the difference between significant and insignificant, you do have a problem. But you, by having to create your own world, are creating a problem in the first place that the impressionist doesn't have, right? You understand that just in terms of how to organize that mass you've got there. That's a significant issue, which is why people buy into formulas of all kinds and things like that, because it makes it tons easier to do imaginative work if you already got a pre-organized formula. But the impressionist just simply says, what's the most practical way to proceed from this to this or that to that? So one of the decisions he makes in all this stuff is he's saying, what is the content of my visual world, right? And so for him, it isn't noses and eyes and ears and musculature and perspective. It's actually spots. Instead of object units, it becomes value units, for example. Dark spots, light spots, how big they are, where they are, what color they are, and where they land in relation to each other. So, and then what they do when they meet. These are categories of phenomena that you're actually organizing in your brain. And there are very important ones in every field. In every one of those things on that list, there's a very important one. And for example, if we're talking about form, we want to know, for example, if a figure is standing there with a great round watermelon form and an egg on top and the wall's flat, then those first two or three forms are major forms. They're big, right? So if we're saying, like a Boston School painter, we're going to have all the horses pulling at once, we want to know the names of all the horses latent in a visual impression. They do include form. They include light effects. They include edge. They include size of masses. They include color and color relations. Okay, so you're realizing that each one of these is a category. And this whole conversation, by the way, comes around to that, right? The whole question of categorization. So another person might pick a whole different category of animal. I'm going to study noses and ears till my eyes fall out. I'm going to understand the various types of human heads. And for use in storytelling pictures or symbolism and stuff like that, those are interesting categories. But even to actually articulate one of those things, just say the nose. If you haven't mastered the abstractions of the visual world and learn to categorize and organize those, you're not going to do as good a job as a guy who has. And you're left with the alternative of mindless noodling and et cetera, as I've said before. So, or tracing from a photograph. Which I suggest, by the way, that everybody who's doing it that respects himself, just stop. Don't do it. You're missing the boat. You're missing the entire point of this thing. The fact that you can make something look like a painting because that you copied off of a photograph doesn't mean you're even slightly in the same world. But that's just me and my strong opinion. So let me just read you a couple other ones. They bring up other points, okay? And again, this is in a discussion from The Organized Mind, and the guy's name is Daniel Levin. He's, by the way, it says there's the author of This Is Your Brain on Music. That's funny. I don't have any idea what that one's about, but I just read that for the first time. All right, so many trivial decisions. So somebody was asking me recently about details in painting, In fact, recently I was in a class and I saw a student saying, "Oh, you mean you put details in the start?" Because I was asking her to articulate the look of nature at one of these leading points in a painting. And I said, "Oh, that's interesting that you think that word detail applies there. It's not detail, though. It's fineness. It's actually preciseness." So the look of nature, the actual look of nature in that first mark, make it as like as you can the first time and then make it more like. So, so the idea of trivial decisions, if you did that in lots and lots of places where you're talking about minor contrast, you'd be doing trivial decisions. If you do every little color note, trying to do the whole painting, exhaust yourself doing that, you're making trivial decisions. What we need major masses of color, not necessarily, in fact, in my opinion, not ideally, massed in with big fat brushes in a huge way, but we're after great fields of color and how the great fields of color relate to each other. That gives you a categorization thing from a primary, a major to a minor sort of a category, right? So the difference between trivial decisions and major decisions. Last week I was in a workshop, might refer to it again, with some pastel artists, and in one case we'd set up a portrait and it had only 4 basic values, And it was difficult for some people to actually get those 4 values right. It was actually, it was 4 major values: the head, the hair, the background, and the shirt color. Basically, the head into the chest was all one basic big value. There's 5 literal values. And a great deal of work was being done within those values while missing the rightness of the majors, right? Well, you see what we mean by that then. So those are major decisions. So everything major is a major decision. Size relationships, the major proportions, you have the proportions of the major value units, right? Or the proportions of these value units to each other is more important than what happens to the value units internally, right? So at any rate, so that gets you, so this idea of many trivial decisions. Anyway, but many trivial little decisions create neural fatigue, leaving no energy for important ones. So these are all quotes from the book. Not wasting time on things that are not your highest priority. So do you know how to prioritize in painting? So figure that out. Figure out what's significant. I ran into that early on. There was a conversation about Paul Baudry, and somebody said about him that he understood the significant line. He was unique and special and important, and what he was doing was important in that pursuit of significant line. What is that, right? So are there significant values? Is there significance over insignificance? So, but that's you, and that's how you're going to organize your materials, right? Organize your mind, organize the materials. So prioritization is huge, right? But the idea of categories is so key to this kind of thing. And by the way, in the case of priorities, some people argue that values are a higher priority than the hue, and they would be right. People have taken me to argue that that's not true. I don't say that's not true, but in the end, a great painting is a great painting because it's good in all these ways. I mean, a poorly colored picture. There used to be an old aphorism coming out of the academics that the picture well drawn is well enough colored, and I know I read that in some piece of some document that Gamble gave me to read, and that's it's a complete exaggeration in the first place. But when you get down to the point of painting, if you're not talking about color being part of the beauty, you're really talking funny. It's like saying flowers can grow and not have any colors on them, and we'll still think of them the same way. It's just not true. Their form may be very nice, but that's not primarily what they're about. And many pictures are primarily about color, are primarily beautiful, or initially beautiful, at least primarily because of color. So those are forms of prioritization, though, too. So among other things, this is another conversation here about cognitive blind spots and inattentional blindness. The argument, and this is where I might be messing with their writing, but the argument seems to be that there is a tendency to blind spots, to actually not notice things. And in fact, I remember one day Gamble was pointing at some berries on a table that I hadn't painted in yet in my lay-in, and he said, "I bet you never even saw those." And there's something rather like that, right? But I found actually in painting that you create intentional blind spots if you're smart. You actually, what he calls inattentional, but you create blind spots. In other words, you say, "I'm not going to work on that," right? So that's in the class. If you categorize things into important versus not important, then you know when you're looking at something, or when you find yourself working on something, you know when you think about it again isn't important. You immediately withdraw your attention. Eventually, you learn to know the difference between the important things and the minor things. So you can actually create what he calls cognitive blind spots. And I'm going to use the words I said probably a little crookedly. But by the way, he would probably argue that everything I'm saying is a deviation from what he's really saying. But I don't mind. This has got nothing for me to do with science except for the idea of organizing the material you have and being a priority to being successful in making a likeness of whatever's in front of you. Which, remember, is your first job. If you can't do that, you can't do. And so he has this idea of attentional filters. He says the attentional filters, that successful people narrow the attentional filter. They live completely in the moment. Well, the attentional filter, so you look at an area where we have this other organizational thing, and it's called the backstraggler, right? Once you lay in a painting, you're looking at this covered canvas, and you're looking at it, and you say, "Oh, there's something wrong over in this area over here." And then you say, so that area is going to be the area where the back straggler is, right? That's the part that's least like when you're looking at the whole, right? It's always important to say when you're looking at the whole. And so when you're looking at the whole, there's this back straggler, and you then say, okay, so what is that, right? So, oh, that's an angle problem. And then immediately your brain pops up, just eliminates everything else from your brain, except angle in the angle world, right? So angle to vertical, angle to angles, and angle to sets of angles, and, all through the entire panel. But that's purposeful. It's an attentional filter. In other words, you're limiting what you're going to actually attend to, right? So, but these are all very fun ideas. I mean, and most of them appear in the first third of this book. I have a way of rating some books that I scan them to see what kind of data is in them, and then every once in a while I find a bunch of interesting stuff. Then I look further and don't find anything else interesting, and I throw the book aside because and frankly, I'm not one of these guys who thinks I have to read everything you say. In fact, this guy, like many other science writers, they bore me to death. Max Meldrum does. He goes on and on and on. I get your point. Bye. See you later. Now, I do look in case I've missed it. And as I work with it, I find out if I've missed something. I might go back and read again, read more closely to see what it is about what was said that I missed. But, man, I advise you, especially painters who are mostly about seeing, who are about the spatial and all that stuff and color, to don't not read, but don't torture yourself. Don't feel like there's some ethic about reading the book from front to back. Ideas are ideas, right? But when you come upon an idea, do read well at that point. Try to really fathom it and read page before and page after, whatever you have to do to get it fully into your mind. Just cheap advice, right? Am I going ridiculously long? Yes, I am. I want to cover just a couple other things, and then I'll be out of here. So the point he makes is attention is a limited capacity resource. To pay attention to one thing means you won't pay attention to something else, right? So I'm asking again, what are you going to pay attention to? If you're going to pay attention to the perspective, you're going to spend hours and hours and hours. But if you're going to pay attention to spots and where they land in angle relationship to each other, you're going to get perspective. The perspective is going to come to you. Just do angles to vertical, you're going to get the perspective. Unless you're really sleeping when you do those things. But attention is a limited resource. You don't want to run out of gas. And that's exactly what I used to find over and over again. I get to this point. Every day, by the way, I get to the point of neural exhaustion because your brain can only make so many decisions before getting there. So, I'll stop at that. I'm sorry it was a little bit random and all over the place, but take in something like this book. But take in our data. Say, what is the nature of the data that we're working with? And how would you best organize it? It's not going to hurt a thing, right? And if you put this side by side with the one where I'm talking about learning how to think and so on, I think you'll have a little bit more of a sense of the fact that we aren't. What's the right word? We aren't inspired. What am I saying? Talents. we are educated thinkers. We're craftsmen who have learned how to think with our materials, and best practices are all functions of. What's the best practice is a function of thought, and a function of consideration, a function of hearing people talk, and then, of course, all your own experiences. But get that in your mind, and I think that's the best I can do with that. I'm feeling a little bit lame brain today. But anyway, so thank you. Do subscribe and all those things, comment, whatever you like to do. And thank you very much for being here.